The courtroom in the federal building downtown had been reserved for 3 days. The case was expected to take at least that long. Consolidated Grain Sciences, one of the largest agricultural biotechnology companies in the country, had brought a patent infringement suit against a 68-year-old soybean farmer named Earl Jessup. The company had a team of 7 attorneys. Earl had one. But something unusual had happened the night before the trial. Earl's lawyer, a woman named Catherine Pryor, had filed a last-minute motion to admit a single piece of physical evidence. The document was old, the paper was yellowed at the edges, and the ink had faded in places. It had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had turned soft. It was a receipt, dated November 14, 1961. The judge had reviewed the motion that morning and allowed the admission. The lead attorney for Consolidated, a man named Martin Schell, had objected immediately. He called it irrelevant. He called it a delay tactic. He said a 63-year-old piece of paper had no bearing on a modern patent case. The judge overruled him, and now Earl Jessup sat at the defense table with the receipt inside a clear plastic sleeve resting flat beneath his folded hands. The dispute had started 14 months earlier. A field inspector working for Consolidated Grain Sciences had taken soil and plant tissue samples from a public road bordering Earl's property. The samples were sent to the company's laboratory in St. Louis. 3 weeks later, the results came back positive. The soybeans growing on Earl Jessup's 340 acres contained a genetic marker, a specific protein sequence that Consolidated had patented in 2009. The company called it GS7. It was engineered to resist a particular herbicide that Consolidated also manufactured. The marker was proprietary, and according to the lab results, it was present in 94% of the plants sampled along Earl's fence line. Consolidated legal department sent Earl a letter. The language was polite, but the message was clear. Their patented genetic material had been detected on his property. They requested a meeting to discuss licensing fees and retroactive royalty payments. The letter estimated the amount owed at $214,000. Earl read the letter at his kitchen table. Then he called Catherine Pryor. Catherine had practiced agricultural law in the region for 22 years. She had represented farmers in contract disputes, land use cases, and USDA compliance hearings. But she had never gone up against a biotech patent suit before. Few private attorneys had. The companies almost always won. She drove out to Earl's farm the next day. They sat on his front porch while he explained the situation. "I never bought their seed," he said. "Never signed a licensing agreement. Never used their herbicide." He pointed toward the soybean field stretching south along the creek. "Those plants came from seed I saved from last year's crop, same as I've done every year since I took over this farm from my father." Catherine asked the obvious question. "Then how did their genetic marker end up in your field?" Earl shook his head. "Wind. Bees, runoff from the Compton place next door." He gestured north. "Danny Compton planted Consolidated seed 3 years ago." He looked at Catherine. "Their genetics drifted onto my land. I didn't invite it." Catherine nodded slowly. This was not a new problem. Cross-pollination and genetic drift between farms had been a known issue in agricultural biotechnology for over 2 decades. Pollen travels, seeds scatter. Modified genetics don't stop at fence lines. That the law hadn't caught up to the biology. In most cases, the patent holder's rights were upheld regardless of how the genetic material arrived. If the marker was present, the farmer owed royalties. It didn't matter if the contamination was accidental. Earl knew that. Most farmers in the county knew that. Several had already signed licensing agreements with Consolidated after receiving similar letters. It was cheaper than fighting, but Earl hadn't signed, and Consolidated had filed suit. The pre-trial hearings lasted 3 months. Schell's team presented lab reports, patent filings, genetic sequencing data, and licensing agreements from dozens of other farmers in the region who had paid. The argument was straightforward. The GS7 marker is our intellectual property. It was found in the defendant's crop. The law is clear. Catherine challenged the sampling methodology. She questioned whether roadside samples could accurately represent an entire field. She filed motions requesting disclosure of Consolidated's cross-contamination studies. Most of the motions were denied. At a pre-trial conference, Shell had spoken to Catherine in the hallway. He shook his head. "Miss Pryor, your client is a good man. I'm sure of it." He adjusted his tie. "But the science doesn't care about that." He smiled. "Every seed he planted contains our property." Catherine didn't respond. She drove back to Earl's farm that evening. Earl was sitting at the kitchen table when she arrived. In front of him was a metal box, the kind with a small latch, the kind people used to store documents before filing cabinets were common. He opened the box and pulled out a single piece of paper. Catherine looked at it. It was a handwritten receipt from the Dawson Feed and Seed Company in Carthage, Missouri, dated November 14, 1961. The purchase was for 10 bushels of Clark variety soybeans at $2.35 per bushel. The buyer's name was written in ink at the top, James R. Jessup, Earl's father. Earl placed the receipt on the table. "My daddy bought those beans 63 years ago," he said. He tapped the paper gently, "and every crop I've ever grown came from seeds saved off that original stock." Catherine stared at the receipt. Then she looked at Earl. "Every year?" "Every year," Earl said. "Same variety. Same practice. My father taught me seed saving when I was 12. He leaned back. "We never bought commercial seed." "Not once." Catherine picked up the receipt carefully. "Earl," she said, "if this is true, then the soybeans on your farm aren't derived from any patented variety." She looked at him. "They predate the patent by nearly 50 years. Earl nodded. "That's what I've been trying to tell them." The trial began on a Tuesday morning. The courtroom was full, not with corporate observers or legal analysts, but with farmers. Word had traveled through the county that Earl Jessup was going to trial instead of settling. Farmers drove in from 3 states. Some brought their wives. A few wore seed caps with the names of companies that no longer existed. Shell presented Consolidated's case first. He was thorough, confident, and precise. Genetic sequencing reports showed the GS7 marker in Earl's soybeans. Patent documentation confirmed Consolidated's exclusive ownership of the trait. A licensing expert calculated the unpaid royalties. $214,000, the expert said, based on 3 years of unauthorized commercial use of the patented genetic material. Then Catherine stood. She didn't challenge the sequencing. She didn't argue the patent was invalid. She asked a different question entirely. She called Earl to the stand. "Mr. Jessup," she said, "can you describe where you get the seed you plant each year?" Earl spoke calmly. "I save it from the previous harvest, same as my father did. Same as his father did before him." Shell shifted in his chair. Catherine continued. "And do you know the original source of that seed?" Earl nodded. "Clark variety. My father bought it in 1961 from the Dawson Feed and Seed Company." He paused. "Before Consolidated Grain Sciences existed." Catherine turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter Defense Exhibit 1. She held up the clear plastic sleeve. Inside was the receipt. Yellowed paper. Faded ink. A handwritten record of 10 bushels of Clark variety soybeans purchased 63 years ago. Shell stood immediately. "Objection. A receipt from 1961 has no relevance to a patent issued in 2009. Catherine turned to him. "It has every relevance." She placed the receipt on the evidence table. "Because it establishes the origin of the defendant's seed stock." The judge leaned forward. "Continue, me." Creel. Catherine pulled a second document from her folder. "This is a genetic analysis conducted by the University of Missouri's Agricultural Research Laboratory." She placed it beside the receipt. "They tested seed samples taken directly from Mr. Jessup's storage bins." She opened the report. The analysis confirms that the base genome of Mr. Truman Jessup's soybeans is consistent with the Clark variety originally developed at the University of Illinois in the 1950s. Shell frowned. That doesn't explain the presence of our marker. Catherine nodded. You're right. She pulled out a third document. This is a cross-contamination study conducted by the same university lab. They tested soil samples, pollen drift patterns, and seed dispersal data from fields adjacent to Mr. Jessup's property. She placed it on the table. The study confirms that the GS7 marker entered Mr. Jessup's crop through wind-borne pollen originating from the neighboring farm. She looked at Shell, a farm that purchased Consolidated seed under license. The courtroom murmured. Catherine continued. Mr. Jessup did not purchase your seed. He did not plant your seed. He did not choose to grow your patented trait. She tapped the receipt. His seed stock has been independently maintained for 63 years. She tapped the university report. Your genetic material entered his field without his knowledge or consent. Shell opened his mouth to respond, but Catherine wasn't finished. She pulled out a fourth document. This is a report from the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service. She placed it beside the others. It documents 17 other cases in the past decade where patented genetic markers were found in crops grown from non-commercial saved seed. In each case, cross-contamination from neighboring licensed fields was identified as the source. She looked at the judge. In 14 of those 17 cases, the patent holder was Consolidated Grain Sciences. The courtroom went silent. Several farmers in the gallery exchanged glances. One man in the third row pulled off his cap and ran his hand through his hair. Catherine took a step back. Your Honor, the defendant did not infringe on any patent. She pointed to the evidence table. The receipt proves the origin of his seed. The genetic analysis proves his crop is an heirloom variety. The contamination study proves the patented material arrived through natural biological processes beyond his control. And the USDA report proves this is not an isolated incident. She paused. Consolidated didn't come to this courtroom because Mr. Jessup stole their property. She looked at the corporate legal team. They came because their property contaminated his. Shell sat very still. He didn't whisper to his colleagues. He didn't reach for his notes. He stared at the stack of evidence on the table. One yellowed receipt beside 3 scientific reports. The judge called a recess. When the court reconvened 2 hours later, she spoke directly. The plaintiff has presented evidence that its patented genetic marker is present in the defendant's crop. That is not in dispute. She paused. However, the defense has presented compelling evidence that the defendant's seed stock originates from an independent, pre-patent variety maintained continuously for over 6 decades. Furthermore, the contamination analysis indicates the patented material entered the defendant's field through natural cross-pollination from a neighboring licensed property. She folded her hands. The court finds that the defendant did not knowingly or intentionally cultivate the plaintiff's patented trait. The presence of the GS7 marker in the defendant's crop is the result of genetic drift, not infringement. She looked at Shell. Case dismissed. The plaintiff shall bear all court costs. The courtroom exhaled. Someone in the back clacked once before catching himself. Earl sat at the defense table for a long moment. He didn't move. Catherine put a hand on his shoulder. He nodded. Outside the courthouse, farmers surrounded Earl on the steps. An older man from 2 counties over shook his hand. You just told the biggest seed company in the country that they can't own the wind. Earl shook his head slowly. I didn't tell them anything. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the plastic sleeve with the receipt still inside. My father told them he just had to wait 63 years for someone to listen. A reporter from the Agricultural Press asked one final question. Mr. Jessup, are you worried Consolidated will appeal? Earl looked at her. He put the receipt back in his pocket carefully, the same way his father must have placed it in the metal box decades ago. They can appeal all they want, he said. He turned and walked toward the parking lot where his truck was waiting. But they can't ungrow what was already in the ground. 6 months later, Consolidated Grain Sciences quietly revised its contamination enforcement policy. The company announced it would no longer pursue patent claims against farmers whose crops tested positive for genetic markers if the farmer could demonstrate independent seed lineage predating the patent. Earl Jessup went back to farming. He planted the same saved seed the following spring. Clark variety. Same as every year. Same as his father, and the receipt stayed in the metal box on the kitchen table right where it had been for 63 years.